Okay, so we are in the fourth section here of chapter 6 on shamanism, which is part 3, the mythology of the primitive hunters, and volume 1 of the Masks of God, primitive mythology. And part 4 of this chapter is called the Firebringer. And here what Campbell does is he elucidates the myth of the shamanistic trickster with a number of myths from Native Americans that illustrate the whimsical character of the shaman, the trickster nature of him. The shaman is a trickster and is often pictured in myth as a trickster. And he starts off by telling a couple of comical stories of this character called Old Man, who is sometimes swapped out as Coyote amongst the Blackfoot Indians. And the Blackfoot Indians are a Plains Indian tribe that is not that far away from the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians, where the trickster there appears famously as Raven. He appears as Old Man / Coyote in these Blackfoot legends. And in this first one, it says, one day, Old Man is walking along, and he hears a funny sound of a bird that he's never heard before, and he looks up and sees it on a branch, that it's doing a trick. Every time it makes a certain sound, its eyes pop out of its head and stick onto the tree. Then it makes another sound, and the eyes come back. Then he does it again, and the old man's watching, and he says, "Hey, little bird, why don't you teach me your trick?" And the bird turns and sees him there and says, "Oh, well, why, sure, I can show you how to do the trick, but remember, you can only do it 3 times. Don't do it any more than that, or you'll regret it." Old man says, "It's your trick, teach." So he teaches him how to do the trick. So Old Man learns how to do the trick, throws his eyes against the tree, calls them back, throws them again, calls them back, does it a 3rd time. Then after he's done it 3 times, he says, "Well, why did the bird just limit me to 3 times? I mean, this is fun. I'm having fun doing this. I'm going to do it again." So he does it a 4th time, and this time the eyes remain stuck on the tree. They won't come back. So he's scrabbling about rather comically. He's blind. He can't find his eyes. Meanwhile, Wolf happens by and decides to have a little fun here. Wolf finds the carcass of a buffalo that is old and rotting, and he picks up some of its meat, and he brings it over to Old Man, who by this time is very hungry now. He smells the rotten meat, but he's hungry anyway. And as he's fumbling about to reach it, every time he reaches for the meat, Wolf takes it away from him, and then moves around. Wolf takes it away again, until at one point he manages to grab hold of Wolf, grabs one of Wolf's eyes, pops it out of its socket, puts it in his socket, and uses it to go back and find his eyes. And then, of course, after that, he's never able to do the trick again. But that's one example of the comical nature of these shamanic characters. There's another story of Old Man, where he's walking along one day, and he sees these rabbits. It's at night. He sees the rabbits with a campfire burning, and he sees them doing this trick where they're all throwing themselves on the fire, and they're singing a magic song to protect them against the fire, and then they all jump up again. And they're having fun doing this. And Old Man wanders by and he says, "Hey, rabbits, would you teach me how to do that trick? That looks like fun." And they say, "Oh, sure, come on, Old Man, we'll show you how to do this trick." And they say, "Just remember, don't lay too long in the fire." So they teach him the song to protect him against burning. And Old Man hops, lays down on the fire, lays his back down on it. Doesn't bother him at all. He lays there for a while, and then he gets up and he says, "Oh, that's great. That's a great trick. Why don't you guys all lie down, and we'll do the same thing with you." And all the rabbits agree. They all lie down. But then Old Man covers them and prevents them from getting up and fries them, basically. One female rabbit escapes, who begs for her life and says she's pregnant. Old Man lets her go because otherwise there would never be any rabbits in the world. So he lets her go, and this is why the backs of rabbits are singed to this day. And then Old Man eats all the rabbits that he has outsmarted. So that's that story. So that gives you a sense of the whimsical nature of these trickster shaman-type characters. Now, as I said, on the Northwest Pacific Coast, the same character there appears as Raven. To the woodland Indians, he appears as Rabbit Man, the great hare. So we have Rabbit Man, sometimes Coyote amongst the Blackfoot, sometimes Old Man, and Raven on the Northwest Pacific Coast. There is a Koryak myth that I think is amusing and worth recounting. It was one of Campbell's favorites. He doesn't recount it here, but he does in the Historical Atlas. It's a Koryak shaman myth about Raven, who appears there. Even though this is across the water in Siberia, we see Raven appearing as a character there, just as we did see the raven-headed sons of the old shaman man living up in the iron house in the previous myth that we recounted of the Siberian myth of the shaman. And so the story goes that there are 4 characters. The main character amongst the Koryaks is simply named Universe. He's the great creator being. And Big Raven is a sort of consubstantial reflection of his essence. The two are basically one, but separate at the same time. The universe is married to Rain Woman, and the story opens up with too much rain going on. Raven is living in his house with his son Imemkut. They're living there, and they're just getting flooded, and it just keeps on coming down, and it won't stop. And Big Raven says to his son, something's going on up there with the universe. We better go up there and pay him a visit. So they put on their raven suits, and they fly up through the hole in the world ceiling to go to the home of the universe. And they go in, and they hear a drum going, the old shaman drum. So they hear it, and they go in, and they see that what has happened is that universe has cut out Rain Woman's vagina, and he's put it onto the shaman drum, and he's taken off his own penis, and he's using it as a stick to beat the drum with. And as he beats the drum, rain is coming down out of her vulva, and it's raining and raining and raining. But he sees Big Raven and Imemkut come in, and he stops. And he says, let me entertain you. So they entertain the guests for a little while, and they leave. But it's the moment that Big Raven and Imemkut leaves, they start doing it again. So they decide to make themselves invisible. They transform themselves into little hairs on the floor so that they can see what happens. And they keep going. He keeps banging the drum. Rain keeps coming. And so Big Raven has to put universe to sleep and his Rain Woman wife to sleep. So he puts them to sleep, goes and gets the vulva and the penis drumstick and roasts them carefully over flames, making them nice and crisp, so that when Universe Man gets up and they do the drumming again, this time the waters dry up and the weather is great. So Big Raven and his son fly back down to the world, and the weather is perfect, but there's no game. The herds aren't coming, so they realize they have to go back up and tell them to bring the herds. So they fly back up, and they tell Universe, where are all the herds? And Universe says, oh, yes, I've been negligent in my duties. I've forgotten. Don't worry, I'll fix it. And so he fixes it, and then the herds come back. So that's an example of another shamanic ascent in bird form to the upper world to commune with the spirits there, because it's always the idea that what's happening down here on the phenomenal visible plane, everything that is happening there is the result of noumenal, hidden causes up in the other world, in the astral plane. That's where the causes that are bringing about effects on the physical plane are happening. And then to compare this, we hop across the water back to North America, to the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians, where we find an example of Raven stealing the fire. So this chapter, after all, is called The Firebringer, and it's really focused more on the idea of the shaman trickster bringing fire. Usually the making of fire is analogized to the sex act. In that myth, we saw that the sex act was analogized to the banging of the drum. But in this myth, we have a myth of Raven stealing the fire. So Raven is flying along. He's a creator being. The world is completely dark. He can't see very well, but he's flying along, and as he's flying along, he's making hills and valleys and trees, and he's making everything productive and fruitful, but he's still having a hard time seeing. So he takes off his raven suit, he lands, takes a rest, and he looks around. And it occurs to him, he remembers that he originated in the world of light up there, and that there was light up there at one point. So he puts his raven suit back on, flies up through the hole in the world ceiling to visit the chief creator's house, where it's not too far away. He camps out, takes off his raven suit, leaves it by the entrance to the upper world, and then he spies a woman who is coming along to draw water from the well. She puts the bucket in the water, and he thinks she's very beautiful, so he turns himself into a cedar leaf and floats down into the water. She drinks it, drinks the leaf, and it impregnates her, and so after a while she gives birth to a son, who is of course Raven reincarnated. And she lives with her father, the creator being, and they live in a little cabin up in the sky. And they raise this son, and he's a complete delight to them. The only problem is that he's crying. He wants something. He's constantly crying, making this strange sound, ama, ama, ama. And they can't figure out what he's referring to. So they ask their soothsayers, what is the child upset about? And they tell him, well, he wants to play with the box that you have that contains the May inside of it up in the closet there. So the chief creator man goes up, gets the box, and brings it down to the raven boy, who then grabs it, makes off with it, runs back to the entrance to the upper world, puts his raven suit on, and then flies back to this world. And when he gets down here, opens the box and pulls out the sun. and illuminates it in the sky. So it's the sun in this case, but it's still a variation of the fire theft motif, which is universal all over these Native American tribes. And to conclude with this set of myths, let's compare it with a coyote story, also a Blackfoot myth, where coyote, and this is a common myth, it's found all over the Native Americans, it's found as far as the Andaman Islanders, who are now extinct, who used to be off the Bay of Bengal in the Melanesian zone. But so what happens is that coyote one night is up on a cliff, and in the far, far distance he sees a scintilla of light, and he realizes it's fire. And he thinks, let's go get that fire and bring it to man. Man will need that. He'll find it useful. So let's go get it. So he brings his fastest running companions, antelope, wolf, and fox, and they all go down to visit the fire people, and they go in and knock on their cabin where the fire is burning, and they say they want to participate and have a party and warm themselves. So the fire people allow them to come in. And then they complain as they're going around the fire, as they're dancing around it, that the flames are too low. Turn them up. So the fire people turn them up. Turn them up some more, and they turn them up more and more. And pretty soon, the other three animals, the antelope, the fox, and the wolf, complain that it's too hot in here for them, so they have to go outside. But meanwhile, they take up their positions for a relay race outside, and they leave Coyote inside. Coyote has made a special kind of headdress out of pine wood and bark shavings, a very highly flammable thing. And he's going around the fire, and he feigns an accident where he trips, and the headdress gets lit on fire. He pretends to be afraid, and he runs out, and he hands off the headdress to Antelope. And the fire people come out, and they kill Antelope, but not before Antelope hands it off to Fox. And then they catch up with Fox, kill Fox, but not before Fox hands it off to Wolf. And then they eventually kill Wolf. Eventually it winds up with Coyote, and he's running with this thing burning on his head, running along comically, and the fire people are just about to catch him when he lights one of the trees on fire. And that explains the myth of how human beings have access to fire now from these burning trees that Coyote has made for them. So we see illustrated in these five myths the comical shamanistic nature of the shaman trickster being. But I also want to draw your attention here to the acculturation phenomenon once again, because I think here we can clearly start to see the influence that Native American culture has had on American popular culture. It's been quite enormous. These characters have all turned up in our popular culture. Coyote has turned up as Wile E. Coyote in the Looney Tunes. The Woodlands version of this character, the rabbit, a rabbit man, is of course Bugs Bunny. Mouse is a character who turns up amongst the Northwest Pacific Coast Indians, who later surfaces in American pop as Mickey Mouse. And also Raven turns up as characters like Heckle and Jekyll, the blackbirds in the cartoons that were constantly up to no good. So these characters, all of these clever, wily animal characters have surfaced up through the sign regime that has come in. The incoming process we've already termed landnama, which is a term, a Scandinavian term for the process of land naming, claiming, and taking. When a new people moves into a new landscape with a pre-existent mythological sign regime, they look for local equivalents that will fit the semiotic slots that are now vacant as they move in, since they need local equivalents to fill those slots. And when they move in, they name this hill, that mountain, or that tree after biblical names or what have you. So this civilization, this biblical Christian industrial civilization that has come in, though over time is slowly acculturated by the older myths of the native Aboriginal inhabitants who have been in the land for a much longer period, and their sign regime is much older and therefore stronger, and it slowly bubbles up through the surface. So we've already noted that most of our comic book superheroes also have come out of Native American myth. Spider-Man and Spider-Woman were Navajo characters. Batman was a character, a Mesoamerican character. Look up, do a Google search on the Jade Batman God, and you'll see an exact equivalent of Bob Kane's Batman. Wolverine, of course, as we've already remarked, was also a Native American character. Black Panther was a Mesoamerican character, the Jaguar, and so forth. So all of these characters have come up through this process of acculturation into American pop culture. This is why it's so important to learn, for Americans, to learn Native American myths, to track these processes. And so Campbell comes to the conclusion of this chapter by drawing an analogy between these trickster shamanistic firebringers to our Western firebringer, Prometheus. And he points out how Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy contrasts the biblical myth of the fall with its dreary nature, its emphasis on shame, guilt, and sin, and this act of disobedience, to the great Greek myth of Prometheus, which Aeschylus in his play Prometheus Bound celebrates, basically when he has Prometheus say, I care nothing for Zeus. He can do as he likes. Basically, Zeus can go fuck himself, is what he's saying. And that really is the Western attitude for both Nietzsche and Campbell. Prometheus becomes the emblematic figure of Northwestern, what Spengler called Faustian civilization, with its attitude of defiance against authorities, defiance against tradition, the willingness to break taboos, to go out on the shamanistic vision quest. So there is a certain way in which the Western myth, the Promethean mentality of the myth that has led to the stealing of fire and the lighting up of the planet at night with electricity. We have indeed stolen the fire from the gods, stolen the thunderbolts of Zeus and turned them into rockets and sent them to the moon. This has been indeed a shamanistic civilization in disguise that has broken through the old idea of the Book of Job that Campbell contrasts with all this as submission to the will of God. The tension between God and man is recognized in both the Hebrew tradition and the Greek tradition. But in the Hebrew tradition, it is God that is there sided with, and it is man who must submit, as Job submits to God when he says, mine ears have heard of thee, now mine eyes have seen, I submit. That's Islam, to submit. That's a different civilization. That isn't the West. The West is based on the other myth, the Promethean myth of defiance against authority, the willingness to trust one's own instincts and go out on the adventure on one's own into the dark forest oneself and to find the fire and bring it back, whatever the consequences of that may be. And they may not always be comfortable consequences. And so that brings us to the end of chapter 6, the chapter on shamanism. And next up will be chapter 7 on the animal master.